Good afternoon, students. During the last session, we discussed that the main focus under this course, financial management, will be on public limited companies. So given that we went through the scope of corporate finance, the main decisions of financial management, the role of the board of directors, chief financial officer, finance manager, and the ultimate objective of the financial management. So let's continue from that point onwards. Let me share the screen. Right. So in a public limited company, shareholders are the owners. And the board of directors, which is the governing body who deals with the board policy, and they are appointed by the shareholders by voting. And board of directors are supposed to act as stewards of shareholders. Managers are recruited by the company to control the smooth flow of day-to-day operations. So remember, shareholders, they are the owners. Directors are appointed by the shareholders, and the company employs or hires managers as employees. So the shareholders line අයිතිකාරයෝ විදිහට board of directors appoint කරන shareholders ලා company එක hire කරන employees ලා තමයි managers ලා කියන්නේ. Okay? So the same thing is included here. Shareholders are owners. Directors are elected by the shareholders, so they deals with the board policy, and managers are hired. So they are employees of the organization, and they make most of the decisions. So an agency relationship. So first we look at what an agency relationship and the link between the agency relationship and the company's ownership and the control. In an agency relationship, agents are supposed to perform a service on behalf of the principals. And most of the times, principals delegate decision-making authority to the agents. That the agency relationship එක කියන්නේ මොකක්ද කියන එක මුලින් බලමු. සහ ඒකේ සම්බන්ධය මොකක්ද දැන් මේ අපි ඩිස්කස් කරන දේවල් වලට. So agency relationship එකකදී නියෝජිතයා agent කියන කෙනා වැඩ කරන්න ඕනේ ප්‍රධානියාගේ අරමුණු ඉෂ්ට වෙන විදිහට. ඒතර නියෝජිතයාට බෑ එයාගේ අරමුණු ඉෂ්ට කරගන්න. ඒ relationship එක ඇතුලේ වෙන්න ඕන දේ තමයි ප්‍රධානියාගේ අරමුණු ඉෂ්ට වෙන විදිහට වැඩ කටයුතු කරන්න ඕනේ. So in the context of finance, there are two most important agency relationships. So still we are referring to the agency relationship. Later on, we'll see what the agency problem is. So in finance, we will be referring to two important agency relationships. So the first one is the relationship between the shareholders and the managers. And the second one is the relationship between the shareholders and the creditors or bondholders. So in this slide, it says agency relationship and the agency problem. And also it talks about shareholders, board of directors, and managers. So let's first look at the agency relationship between shareholders and managers. Managers are the agents of the shareholders. So in this particular agency relationship, managers are considered as the agents. So the main relationship එකේදී නියෝජිතයා වෙන්නේ managers ලා. ප්‍රධානියා වෙන්නේ shareholders. Managers make decisions that conflict with the best interests of the shareholders. So in a public limited company, as we all know, shareholders are the owners and board of directors is the governing body. And the managers are recruited by the company to control the day-to-day operations of the company. And by looking at those activities, you can you can say that there is a separation of ownership and control, because the ownership lies with the shareholders and the controlling is being done by the managers. In contrast, as we discussed last week, in contrast, in a sole proprietorship or in a partnership, ownership and the control could be done by the same party, the owners. But here, as there are many owners, like shareholders, they cannot get together and run the business. Therefore, there's a separate layer as employees called managers. So the ownership lies with the shareholders and the controlling is done by the managers. Separation of ownership and control allows share ownership to change freely but results in agency costs. Now, if the shareholders are not satisfied with the service provided by the managers as agents, shareholders can leave the company. So shareholders are satisfied වෙන්නේ නැත්නම් managers ලගේ service එකත් එක්ක ඒගොල්ලන්ට company එකෙන් අයින් වෙන්න පුළුවන්. So that's why it says allows share ownership to change freely. So if the existing shareholders, if they want to exit from the company, they can sell their shareholdings in the secondary market and get rid of the investment. Okay, so it changes freely. There's no influence from the owners, the changing ownerships, and the way the managers act in the company. However, this results in agency expenses. So we will be looking at what agency expenses are. Okay. Right. So the same, I'm referring to the same slide. So even though managers should take decisions to the best interest of the shareholders, there may be a divergence. Okay, a divergence between the shareholders' wealth maximization goal and the actual goals pursued by the managers. So managers are supposed to act on behalf of the best interest of shareholders. So their objective should also be maximizing shareholders' wealth. That is what they should do. But in practice, we cannot 100% expect such a relationship between shareholders and managers. Okay, because managers as human beings, they have their own interests. Okay, so the primary reason for this divergence, තියෙන්න හේතුව ඒ කියන්නේ owners ලගේ මත නැත්නම් shareholders ලගේ objective එක සහ managers ලගේ objective එක වෙනස් වෙන එක. ඒතර divergence එකක් තියෙන්න ප්‍රධානම හේතුව තමයි the separation of ownership and control. ඒතර by nature company එකක තියෙන දෙයක් තමයි separation of ownership and control කියන්නේ. So that is the main cause behind the divergence of interest between shareholders and managers. Right. So instead of seeking to maximize shareholders' wealth, managers might seek acceptable levels of performance while maximizing their own welfare, okay, their own self-interest, or maybe additional benefits and long-run survival. So we will be looking at each in detail. Okay, so what they should do is to act on behalf of the shareholders to maximize shareholders' wealth, but their interest is quite different. So they want to increase their own welfare, their own self-interest, and also they want to increase additional benefits. At the same time, the job security, or we call it the long-run survival in the company. So what happens is, originally there should be an agency relationship, okay, where managers should act on behalf of the interest of the shareholders. But because of having two different sets of interests, this agency relationship becomes an agency problem. Okay, so මෙතන තියෙන්න ඕනේ agency relationship එක. managers ලා වැඩ කරන්න ඕන shareholders ලාගේ interest එක achieve වෙන විදිහට. නමුත් managers ලා ඒගොල්ලන් human beings. ඒතර ඒගොල්ලන්ට වෙනම interest set එකක් තියෙනවා. එතකොට මෙතන තියෙන මේ divergence එක. මේ දෙක in line නැහැ. ඒකෙන් වෙන්නේ agency relationship එක agency problem එකක් බවට convert වෙන එක. Right? So that is one type of agency problem. So there's another one which is given in slide number 17. Okay, so that is the agency relationship and the agency problem which occurs between shareholders and bondholders. Okay, so bondholders, or we can also call them lenders or maybe creditors, provide long-term debt capital. So in this relationship, the agent is the shareholder who should ensure that the debt capital borrowed is effectively utilized without reduction in the wealth of the bondholders. Okay, so creditors like banks, bondholders, they are the principals of this agency relationship. Okay, and shareholders, they are the agents. So this is quite different from what we discussed earlier. In this case, shareholders act as the agents of bondholders who are the principals. So we have to keep in mind that these creditors like banks, bondholders, they have fixed financial claim on the company's resources. Now, if they have lent money, okay, if the company has borrowed money from these creditors like bondholders or maybe a bank, then there's a fixed claim. Okay, but on the other hand, shareholders, being the residual owners of the company, they have a variable interest. Now, if the company is having good earnings, okay, and if the company decides to pay a good dividend, they will receive a higher dividend payment. But the vice versa could also happen. If the earnings are not that good and if the company decides not to pay dividends, then there will be no dividends for the shareholders. So their income from the company, their earnings from the company is variable, not like for bondholders. Bondholders, it's a financial obligation. The company has to pay, regardless of the level of earnings the company has. The company eකට earnings තිබ්බත් නැතත් මේ financial obligation එක settle කරන්න ඕනේ. ඒක fixed. Shareholders lage එක එහෙම නෙමෙයි, ඒක variable. මොකද company එකට හොඳට earnings තිබුණොත් තමයි dividends pay කරන්නේ. company එකට dividends pay නොකර ඉන්නත් පුළුවන්. So it's not a must. Okay, so because the returns offered to creditors are fixed and whereas the returns to shareholders are variable, there is a conflict of interest, okay, between the creditors or the bondholders or a bank and the owners or the shareholders. So shareholders are the agents under this relationship. So for an example, you can assume that a company wants to invest in a high risky project by borrowing from bondholders and other lenders. Right? It's a high risky project. So in finance, generally we say that if the level of risk of a investment is high, then the company can expect a greater return. Can expect. Okay, the expected return is high. If the risk is high, the expected return is high, but the actual outcome might be different. So here also just assume that the company wants to invest in a high risky project, and if the project turns out to be good, the shareholders would receive a greater dividend, but bondholders only get the agreed interest. Okay, as I said earlier, regardless of the returns. And the same thing could happen if now this is a high risky project now. So if the project or the investment is negatively affected, okay, then the earnings might get affected, and even though there is a lower level of earnings, the company has to make the financial obligation to the bondholders. But from the shareholders' perspective, they might not get a dividend, or they might get a lower level of dividend because it's variable. Okay, so in this type of a case, bondholders might not also prefer to prefer to the unexpected increase in the risk. And company could only high risky venture because they think that this will give them long term benefits. Okay, එනට ඒක risk එක වැඩි නිසා ඒක negative aspect එකකුත් තියෙනවා. Okay, because the actual outcome could be different from what the company expects. Okay, so because of that high risk, the bondholders or the creditors or the lenders might not prefer it, because when the risk level increases, they need more return in order to compensate with the risk. The risk එක වැඩි වෙන්න ඒකට වැඩිපුර return එකක් වැඩිපුර earning එකක් ඒගොල්ලන්ට ඕනේ කරනවා. ඒක තමයි ඒගොල්ලන්ගේ required rate of return එක කියලා අපි කියන්නේ. So when the risk level increases, bondholders or creditors or lenders, they might require a higher level of return. So when the required rate of return goes up, the value of the bond will be negatively affected, because there is an inverse relationship between the required rate of return and the value. The make අපි අත්තටම මේ course එකේ bond valuation වලදී discuss කරන concept එක. Okay, so because of that inverse relationship, bondholders wealth might get negatively influenced. ඒතර ඕකම තමයි shareholders වල වෙන්නේ. නමුත් මෙතනදී අපි කතා කරන්නේ bondholders ලා principal කෙනෙක් විදිහට. Right? So how will bondholders or creditors or lenders will safeguard themselves, safeguard their interest against this kind of a situation? So one way of doing that is to introduce different conditions. We call them loan covenants. මේ loan agreement එකකට එනකොටම මේකේ conditions දානවා. මෙන්න මේ දේවල් කරන්න බෑ. මෙන්න මේ දේවල් විතර කරන්න පුළුවන්. අනේ ඒ වගේ conditions දානවා. ඒත් අපි ඒකට කියනවා covenants කියලා. Okay, ඒතර තියෙන පුළුවන් limitations. දැන් මේකෙන් කරන්නේ ඇත්තටම bondholders ව safeguard කරගන්න තමයි ඒගොල්ලෝ හදන්නේ. Right? Because they are the lenders. So they might impose different limitations on paying dividends, and limitations or restrictions on the type of the investment the company is going to undertake, and the limitations on issuance of other debt. Okay, the company එකට ගන්න පුළුවන් අනිත් ණය ගැනත් ඒගොල්ලන් limitations දානවා. අන්න ඒ වගේ තමයි bondholders, they try to safeguard themselves from under this relationship. Okay, so that is one part. And if we move on to the next slide, agency problem, actually the last slide. So this mainly relates to the agency problem and the agency relationship, I would say, relationship between managers and the shareholders and the managers. So මෙතනදී ගොඩක්ම මේ කියන points, මේ sources and the cost කියන එක ගොඩක්ම link වෙන්නේ අපි මුලින්ම කතා කරපු agency relationship එකට. And how it becomes an agency problem, and how the agency problem could be mitigated. ඒක තමයි මෙතනදී කතා කරන්නේ. Okay, ඒතර මතක තියාගන්න මෙතන කියන ගොඩක් දේවල් අදාළ වෙන්නේ අපි මුලින් කතා කරපු agency relationship එකට. Right, so let's first look at the sources of the agency problem. So this is between the shareholders and the managers. So එතනදී shareholders ලා principal විදිහට, managers ලා agent විදිහට තමයි consider කරන්නේ. Sources of the agency problem. So we know that there should be an agency relationship where the agents should act on behalf of the interest of the shareholders. The shareholders lagi interest එක වෙන්නේ maximizing shareholders wealth. ඒකට තමයි managers ලා වැඩ කරන්න ඕනේ. But we discussed that ඒක වෙන්නේ නැති වෙන හේතු මොකද? Family parties දෙකට, they have two different sets of interests, right? Shareholders want their wealth to be maximized, but on the other hand, agents, they have some other interests. So here, as sources of the agency problem, we will be referring to the sets of interest, or the interest that the managers are having. Then මෙතනදී කතා කරන්නේ මේ source එක විදියට, හේතුව විදියට managers ලාගේ තියෙන interest එක. Okay, contrary to the objectives of the shareholders. So the first one is own utility or own welfare, we call it. ඒගොල්ලන්ගේ welfare එක ගැන, ඒගොල්ලන්ගේ utility එක ගැන තමයි ඒගොල්ලෝ හිතන්නේ, not on shareholders wealth maximization. So own, now for as examples we can say getting a higher salary, or maybe having flexible working hours, or promotions, or training opportunities. So that is their interest. Okay. And the second one, long run survival. So we know that they are managers, are employees of the company. Okay. So shareholders are not, shareholders are owners of the company, and if they want to quit, if they want to exit from the company, they can sell the shareholding. But on the other hand, managers, they are employees. So the concern for long run survival may lead managers to minimize or avoid the amount of risk faced by the company or the business organization, because unfavorable outcomes can lead to their dismissal or possible bankruptcy of the firm. So as we discussed earlier, risky ventures. So if there are risky ventures, okay, we discussed it under the agency problem between shareholders and bondholders also. But just assume that there's a risky venture the company's shareholders want to invest in. But if the from the manager's perspective, since they are worried about their job security or long run survival, they might not want to go for that investment, because if the investment turns out, if it is not going to turn out to be good, then they will be negatively affected. ඒ වගේ අවස්ථාවකදී කරන්නේ එක්කෝ මේ information එක දෙන්නේ නැහැ shareholders ලට, එමත් නැත්නම් එහෙම මේගොල්ලන්ගේ එකට යන්න කැමති වෙන්නේ නැහැ, because they want to safeguard themselves. Okay, right? So just remember that. So here managers might not disclose the information of such investments, and because they want to pursue their job security, not the success of the company. Okay, even though it is a good opportunity where the company can be successful, here they will be thinking about their own survival, long run survival. And next one is consumption of on the job perquisites. We call it perks. So these are additional benefits. Okay, additional benefits to salary and the normal level of benefits that the managers get, like company vehicles and luxurious offices, like discount travel fares, and opportunities for to having better training opportunities in foreign countries. Likewise, there are additional benefits. Okay, additional benefits. So these are very costly. So automatically there is a cost involved. Okay, if they want to safeguard themselves and to have on the job perquisites, as I mentioned, then it's very costly. And also, now these are the sources why an agency problem arises. And having an agency problem in the organization, in the company, it cannot proceed. It cannot continue with the operation smoothly, because there is a kind of a lack of goal congruence, because there are two sets of objectives. Shareholders have the objective to maximize their wealth, and managers have a different set of objectives. So the goals are not aligned. So there is lack of goal congruency. And the other thing is shareholders wealth maximization, which is considered as the ultimate objective of the company, will be suboptimized. So then එන්නේ ඒ වගේ දේවල් නිසා company එකේ survival එකට සහ growth එකට ප්‍රශ්නයක් වෙන්න පුළුවන් මේ problem එක නිසා. Okay, therefore the company will have to take certain actions in order to mitigate the problem. So generally we believe that this type of a problem cannot be eliminated from the company. Okay, but the company can mitigate, right? So costs of agency problems are those strategies that a company can take to mitigate the agency problem. As the first one, restructuring. Okay, so these are certain expenses which are incurred to structure the organization. Okay, a company can remove complex organizational structures in order to prevent the management from uh, making unnecessary decisions and also to eliminate unnecessary organizational layers which hinder monitoring managerial activities. So likewise, the company can restructure. Okay, restructure කරන්න පුළුවන් company organizational structure. Okay, so it cannot be done without a cost. Obviously, there will be a cost. Restructuring programs are very costly. And the second one is monitoring. It's a very common form of agency cost. So monitoring means a company can appoint an audit committee in order to monitor the managerial activities and an internal audit. The company can have an internal audit and an external audit in order to see whether managerial activities are aligned to the shareholders' wealth maximization objective. And next one is also a very popular cost, bonding. So that is actually entering into bonds, okay, or else having the employees bounded to the organization. Okay, a very common form of bonding is employee share option schemes. Okay, so ESOPs, we call it ESOPs, ESOPs. There, what the company does is the company can, it's a kind of a compensation program. Okay, the company can compensate the employees in the form of shares of the company. Okay, so while doing it, the company's objective is to align the interest of the shareholders and the employees, because once the shares are issued to these employees, they also become shareholders of the company. So by doing that, the interests are aligned. Okay, so they become shareholders and they also want to have higher shareholders wealth. Okay, so it's an attempt to align the interests. And the next one is lost opportunities. So as we discussed earlier, shareholders, let's say shareholders want to undertake a project that will increase the share value. Okay, but if the management team is, if they are afraid that things might turn out badly, which might result in the termination of their employment, they might not take this project, and also they might not disclose the information about this project to the shareholders, right? So if it turns out to be a good one, it's good for the company. Okay, but managers, they think about themselves, their long run survival, so they're not going to disclose. Okay, so the returns and the profits lost because of such kind of investment opportunities are called lost opportunities, the opportunity cost. The opportunity cost is considered as, is also as a cost of agency problem. Okay, so remember the first three: restructuring, monitoring, bonding. These three are direct agency costs. They are direct. However, last one, lost opportunities, it is an indirect agency cost. Okay, right. So that's it. So throughout this lesson, we talked about what finance is, what financial management, and how it is linked to corporate finance, financial management decisions of an organization, especially in a company, and the role of the board of directors, CFO, and the managers. Okay, so when it comes to managers, finance manager is one such manager. There are other managers, marketing managers, human resource managers, operations. Okay, so likewise, the entire team is referred to as the managers. And Also, we talked about the concept of separation of ownership and control. And because of that, we discussed that an agency problem, an agency relationship could convert into a agency problem, and the sources of the agency problem, types of agency problems, as the agency problem between the shareholders and the managers, and the agency problem between the bondholders and the shareholders, and finally the costs of agency problem. So in order to mitigate the agency problem, there are inherent costs like what we discussed. So we have to keep in mind that a company cannot proceed or sustain and grow by having the agency problem inside the organization. So they have to get rid of it. So if the generally we assume that the agency problem cannot be eliminated fully, so it has to be mitigated. Okay, as we discussed earlier, it has to be mitigated by incurring agency costs. So that is actually a kind of an overview of the lesson that we discussed during the last week and today. So next day, we will be referring to the third lesson, that is time value of money, because the second lesson, that is on financial environment, we have organized a set of guest lectures for that, to keep you updated about the financial system of Sri Lanka and the components. And so we'll be starting the third lesson on Friday. Okay, so we have allocated 3 sessions for that. So as I mentioned last week, you have to keep a scientific calculator. You need a scientific calculator because from this point onwards, we'll be doing a lot of calculations. So see whether you have it. And since still we are planning to do these sessions online, I mean, for the time being. So you can, if you have a laptop computer, you can use the use a software like Excel to try out the questions as well. So that is it. Okay, and you will be notified about the tutorial classes, tutorial sessions next week. Okay. Okay. So refer to the LMS daily. Right. So thank you.